1979 film High Point, Christopher Plummer loses his grip and plunges to the ground from the tallest building in the world. Of course, it's Dar Robinson, once again doing the impossible. A parachute hidden under his jacket released 3 seconds from the concrete street.
What were you thinking of when you pushed off?
I was hoping it was going to work. What else?
Any doubts?
Yeah, I always have doubts. I did.
The 120-story building in Toronto, Canada intrigued Dar, and it inspired an idea for a spectacular stunt that would bring him back a year later.
That is the world's tallest freestanding structure, the CN Tower in Toronto, Canada.
With Kathy Lee Crosby as host reporter of a 1-hour special featuring Dar performing new stunts, he planned to leap off the tower again, this time without a parachute.
When I first met Dar, his reputation had preceded him, and for some reason I just had felt that this person had to be made of steel and would be, you know, huge. And not that he was small, but I mean, he just was certainly smaller than I had imagined. And I think I thought he was crazy. Well, Dar wasn't there the first time, and they said, oh, just step out on the doorway and then we'll lead you to where we're going to do the thing. You step over this little rim, and it was about a foot wide, maybe 1.5 feet, and it was the wind was blowing unbelievably. And I'm afraid of heights. I couldn't believe anybody would do this.
What we're going to do this time is without a parachute, without an airbag. I'm going to jump from CN Tower with nothing but a small wire hooked to me.
Only a small wire to hold him while he fell. Only a small wire to break his fall a second before he would hit the ground.
3, 2, 1.
But the wind factor down the length of the tower hadn't been fully reckoned with. Sudden gusts could smash him into the building at any moment.
Still too much wind. We've got a problem. I think we've got turbulence. We got a swirl in her, and that's what.
With Kai Michelson, his trusted engineer and close friend, Dar analyzes the wind and weather every day to determine when it will be a safe time to do the jump, and if there will be a safe time.
The wind's too high. Can't take a chance.
Hi! Over!
Compounding the risk factor of the stunt, this equipment had never been tested under these conditions. During one rehearsal with George, the 170-pound dummy, the braking system malfunctions. The jump has been called off a half a dozen times already because of weather or equipment problems. The pressures mount for both Dar and the producers. Costs are soaring. The next major stunt has to be prepared. And the bottom line, is this stunt safe?
I'm afraid of dying. I am not out for the thrills of it. This is my job. I do my job well, and because it scares me so bad, I do everything in the world to make sure that I'm not going to get hurt there.
I don't think Dar would have ever done anything that he didn't think he could do. Absolutely. And that he hadn't researched and that he hadn't tried every conceivable way to protect himself. There was no death wish in Dar at all. Not at least not to my mind. But I think when push came to shove, especially at CN Tower, I think, and all the delays, I think he was nervous and I think he was scared.
Finally, the morning dawned when all the conditions were as favorable as they would ever be. As the crowd gathered in growing numbers to watch, so did the sense of anticipation, especially on the tower itself. The crew knew this was as difficult as any stunt could get. Kai Michelson, Dar's engineer on many stunts before this one, vividly recalls the final moments.
Bob, you got...
I'll never forget, he says, Kai, he says, if this stunt fails and the cable breaks, he says, I'm going to keep my eyes open to the ground. If they perform an autopsy on me, he said, they'll find sand in my eyes. And I'll never forget when he said that to me because it put the fear of God in me. I'll never forget that day.
God, this is scary.
I gotta tell you, nobody's ever gonna cry. Yeah, right with you. We're close, Chief. We're with you all the way there.
I didn't want to be down where my position was to be set and meeting him there at the bottom. I was very uncomfortable. I didn't want to be the interviewer.
Maybe I'll just do a ready, set, go, all right, Kai? Well, maybe we'll go 1 to 10. Or maybe we'll, maybe we won't go. I think we waited too long. Dodger, Cayenne. Oh, what Dodger, Cayenne. Oh, what Dodger, Cayenne. Oh, what Dodger, Cayenne. That man's chant, gang. Woo! Woo! All right, Kai? Yeah. Hey, man, I love you guys. I love you, Dar. All right. Ready, set, go. You ready? Ready? Set.
A harrowing stunt ends in exhilaration.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you aboard the ship Sands. How are you all doing today? Great. Okay, let's have lots of energy. Please laugh at my jokes. My name is Vera. So if you have questions during the
Toronto, the largest city in Canada after Montreal, lies on the north shore of Lake Ontario. It was founded by colonial Americans who remained loyal to the British Crown after the American Revolution. With the finest harbor on the Great Lakes, it flourished on shipping and solid investments. Canada's steady economic expansion since the 1950s and its easy access to the United States has turned Toronto into an international commercial center. But between the new skyscrapers, its civic and domestic architecture offer reminders of the colonial past. Peter Ustinov once said that Toronto was what New York would be like if it were run by the Swiss. He may have been thinking of the city's orderly, if relaxed, air, but he could have been referring to the ease with which people escape from the hard-edged surroundings in which they earn a living to the spacious retreats in which they enjoy their life. Out in the leafy suburbs, where for many the day still begins with a farewell wave from an old-fashioned porch, there are plenty of things that the Swiss, or anyone else, might envy about Toronto. High on the list is the well-thought-out interface of roads and public transportation. The passengers being delivered to this subway station will probably be at work before the driver who brought them can get back home on the freeway, before the goodbye kiss grows cold. As regular as its own timetables, the Toronto subway wins awards for the safest, cleanest, smoothest running system on the North American continent. Without it, Toronto would be an entirely different kind of city. Not only do more people use the subway every year, but those who do use it increasingly often. The average passenger now takes 200 trips a year, compared to only 150 in the mid-1960s.
The subway is the critical part of what Toronto is because it was built over about a 20-year period at the same time as the population of the city of Toronto doubled. We have, I think, two overall goals. First of all, it's simply to provide the best transit service that we can within the resources that were provided, which is a complicated business in and of its own. We got to get the people on and off the trains every morning. But the second has been to support a land use plan and to support a development pattern that will make transit work.
Until 1953, the streetcar and the automobile were adequate forms of transport for a place that was still something of a backwater. But at that critical moment in Toronto's growth, the city fathers showed remarkable vision. In partnership with the surrounding communities, they gave the Toronto Transit Commission some stirring orders. $67 million was invested in a heavy-duty, no-frills subway as the backbone of their people-moving plan for the future. Only well outside the central area of Toronto do trains run on the surface. For many of the underground sections, the builders were able to use the cut and cover method, digging a trench for the track and roofing it over afterwards. But where hospitals and other important buildings stood above, they had to tunnel, running the lines through huge tubes to muffle the noise of the trains. There are two subway lines running roughly east-west and north-south. The routes cover 35 miles and carry nearly 500 million passengers every year. The most heavily used part, the beauty of the system for most travelers, is the U-shaped loop of the north-south line that stitches the downtown area together like a thread. During the first 10 years that the subway was in operation, 90% of the new office buildings erected in Toronto were built within a few minutes' walk of the dozen or so downtown stations. Along the length of the line sprang up sub-centers, which are now virtually cities in themselves. From this control room, the trains speeding along are under constant observation. A computer helps supervisors to set routings and check the progress of traffic. The cars are wide and comfortable, even when packed during the morning and evening rush hours. And they and the stations are virtually free of serious crime. Yonge was the first line of the system to be built. Where it intersects the east-west Bloor and Danforth line is the busiest station in town. It's also deeper than those that serve only one line. Both below and above ground, it has become Toronto's principal crossroads. Keeping the conflicting streams of commuters apart is work for experts.
The biggest problem would be the synchronization of the crowds from one line to the other. When there's a minor delay on one line, that causes a backup of trains and therefore a surge in the crowd flow from one line to the other. So you could have on the east-west line a 5-minute delay, then all of a sudden you have a lot of people coming on the north-south line trying to squeeze onto one train. You can only get about 1,000 people on a train. And in rush hour you can have 3,000 or 4,000 people at the station at one time. You notice in the afternoon they're in a hurry to get home more so than they are to get to work. But you get a lot of rush. The rush hours now are lasting longer than they used to as well. There's more and more people out going to work.
works in ways that many other cities don't. It has a terrific infrastructure. The way the different services relate with each other, whether it's the transit system, the surface transit, the road systems, the computerized efforts that have been made to keep traffic flowing, the citizen activists who've stopped expressways from going into the center of the city, the desire on the part of everyone to keep it working. It's constantly boasting that it's one of the few North American cities with a vibrant set of downtown neighborhoods.
Charlie Pachter may be the Toronto subway's most unexpected fan. He finds it both an inspiration and an opportunity.
At the time, I was looking for work. I had heard a rumor that they were contemplating a mural for one of the stations. And I started to think about the placement in this station of something monumental. And I realized, of course, that hockey is to Canada what wine is to France. So what did I do? I took the two historically most famous rivals in Canadian hockey history, the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. One team was blue and white, the other was red, white, and blue. I wanted to get my work out in a public space, and I'm very mindful of the fact that one image in front of 40,000 people an hour can do more for you than 100 shows around the world. I would probably like to see more stations as events rather than just places that you pass through. For example, given the choice, I would have liked to have done the entire platform in Hockey Players. They only gave me 35 feet. That's all I was allowed. But those are the little things that you're up against. You know, when I would have a grandiose scheme, I'd get a phone call from the head of the TTC saying, well, you know, it's not an art gallery, eh? It's a subway station. You know, that's sort of practical. And our subway, as you can see, is nothing if not practical and clean and matter-of-fact.
Cleanliness, matter-of-factness, Toronto virtues. Above ground, Toronto, like most of Canada, is snowbound for much of the year, but the remainder offers an enviable outdoor life. The summer is all the sweeter for being short. For these few weeks, it's hard to imagine the harsh winter ahead. While the sunshine lasts, everyone makes the best of the lakeside. This has always been a city of immigrants. After World War II, Toronto became a cosmopolitan city. A wave of displaced Europeans diluted the original English-Scottish-Irish mix, getting here however they could. Some of the newcomers did pretty well for themselves.
Welcome to Honest Ed and the great, great city of Toronto.
Here in Toronto there's a famous man, but this guy must be insane. His prices are so low, any day he'll be broke. Honest Ed is his name.
Well, I've been in Toronto 65 years now. I was 9 years old when I came here. I don't know if there's any big secret. I had very little formal education. I had no schooling. And almost 50 years ago, when I was just getting married, I cashed my wife's insurance policy for $214, and we started a small store in this same location. In fact, there's a sign in the corner window. It says the original store was smaller than this window. And that's how it started. And I think there was never a plan, but it was just an involvement and a development. And today we have about 400 employees in this store, and it takes away a big part of a block.
The gaudy discount emporium that bears Ed Mirvish's name is not his only interest. He owns one of London's most famous theatres, the Old Vic, and runs it in partnership with the Toronto's Royal Alexandra Theatre, the keystone of the city's own considerable theatrical tradition.
Hello, Jason. How are we fixed? You got the figures all ready? That's good. All right.
I think you can make it in many of the great cities of the world, but Toronto is my home, and it has presented opportunities, and I've taken advantage of them. Toronto is a very different city today. I think it was after the Second World War that so many different nationalities started to arrive here. And I think it made Toronto a better city. The different cultures, the mosaic of different people is what makes Toronto what it is.
The Italians were the first wave of arrivals from Europe. Then every nationality sought out its corner. Ukrainians, Hungarians, Greeks. The most recent wave of immigrants comes from Vietnam and Hong Kong, enlarging the earlier Oriental community many times over. Enormous investment from Hong Kong, ready money looking for a safe home before the colony is integrated into China, has accelerated the growth inspired by the subway. The deeper Toronto digs, the higher Toronto soars. No matter how much snow falls on Toronto, how bitter the wind sweeping across the lake, the subway ensures that everyone gets to where they have to go, warm and dry. Inside the downtown loop, marked out by the subway, a vast underground city has come into being. It covers 14 square miles. There are atriums, escalators, restaurants, galleries of shops that any city would be proud to see above ground. Its heart, Eaton Centre, occupies 2 city blocks on its own, a subterranean pleasure land where even the weather is forgotten. Banks, office blocks and hotels can all be reached through the basements of the surrounding buildings. 74 entrances altogether. In the 1920s, when the United States, across the water, was in the grip of prohibition, many a shady fortune was made in Toronto from bootlegging. Today, brokers come in on the subway to tend the financial locomotive that powers the city's prosperity. This is now one of North America's top volume exchanges. Gold and other minerals, equities, standard commodities have taken over from the port commerce. Property, too. The lakefront, on which Toronto's earliest fortunes were founded, is now so valuable that more of it must be created by reclaiming land from the water. Everyone in town wants to live there now. The apartments in this building, number 1 Quayside, went on sale for a minimum of $1 million each. Everyone was snapped up within the day. But not everyone was pleased to see that kind of money being paid.
Now, you might be familiar with the term yuppie, young urban professional. Okay, well, this is their heaven. This is where they all live. Harbourfront is now the chic place to live in Toronto. They've all been built within the last 3 years. They're very expensive. First building I'd like to point out to you is Queen's Cave Terminal with the green glass windows. Have any of you visited the terminal building yet today? Yeah, it's really nice. Expensive, too. All my paychecks go into that building, Queens Quay Terminal. The ones in the far right with the green sloping windows are called King's Landing condominiums. Very beautiful when the sun shines on the windows because it looks like a waterfall reflecting from the building. Now they run anywhere from $500,000 to $3.5 million a piece. A little bit expensive, but with this price, you do get a private mooring area for your yacht.
In pre-subway Toronto, some of the better lakeside views were only to be had from public housing tenement blocks. The area was harder to reach then. There were no moorings for yachts and pleasure boats so close to the business center. But when the harbourfront light railway, a largely surface system integrated with the subway, is finished, stockbrokers and bankers will be able to get from the office to their expensive new condominiums without getting their galoshes wet. Mingling economic groups in this way is something Toronto seems to deal with as deftly as shape is imparted to the rails that will carry the harbourfront trains around the curves. In many ways, the light railway was one of the Transit Commission's more complex projects. Deciding to spend $50 million was merely the beginning. Part of the track lay through a tunnel. The maze of cables and plumbing put down by the clusters of existing skyscrapers had to be avoided, moved, or diverted. Building the tunnel alone ate up half the allotted cost. The completed harbourfront line permits passengers to connect with mainline trains as well as the subway system proper. That's the way they like to do things in Toronto. Integration of public transport has been the key policy of the Transit Commission from the beginning. Toronto's surface routes have, of course, spread far beyond the subway's reach. They're organized on carefully calculated grid plans, and detours and new destinations added as demand increases. The same one-fare ticket will take a passenger to any stop on the entire system by train, bus, or streetcar in any combination. Those first old streetcars, rounded up in the United States and given a coat of municipal paint, were labeled Red Rockets. Their successors still run, their timetables, like those of the buses, coordinated with the subway. Every streetcar stop has a telephone to tell travelers when the next one will be along. So much a part of the city are the Rockets that the 50th anniversary of the opening of their first line called for a party.
As a matter of fact, a lot of the streetcars that we bought, like today, the birthday party for the Red Rockets over here, were streetcars that we bought from other North American cities, because in those days they were putting in diesel buses and not believing in something of a rapid transit nature such as a streetcar, which was really a forerunner to some extent of a subway. There's no question that you can't have major development in the city without rapid transit, because people in the city believe in using rapid transit. It's not a socio-economic system, unlike some cities in the world where people go because of their economic situation. As I said to you earlier, a president of a bank would be on that subway, or a doctor, or a lawyer, whatever profession. They'll be riding the subway just as much as anybody else because it's convenient, it's efficient, and that's the kind of system we want. So that it's very important to any development as to where the transit is going.
Toronto now has twice as many people to move about as it did when the first subway line opened. The planners, by redesigning the city from beneath, have been able to keep pace with such dramatic expansion. And there'll be more to come.
We're going to see in Toronto, I think, a replay of some of the dynamics that happened in the United States 20 or 30 years ago, the conflict between the car and transit. People don't decide to leave their car at home because transit is cheaper. It's always cheaper. But if you can provide service, this is where the subway comes in, then the investment in service is what works. And this is what's worked in Toronto. except for the very, very high end of income and people who have 3 or 4 or 5 cars, almost everybody in Toronto uses transit. It's just taken for granted that everybody uses it. It's a community service. We're in the middle of that debate right now. That is, what the decisions taken by Metropolitan Toronto and by the other levels of government over the next 3 or 4 years with respect to that dynamic are going to determine the shape of Metropolitan Toronto for the next 50 years or so.
Those who can afford buy, and those who can't move out to what are now suburban apartment complexes and use the subways to come into work. How is this going to change the city? It's going to be very interesting to watch the next decade. The temples of money are rising around us everywhere. There's a whole new lifestyle called condominium lifestyle. There's a kind of Manhattanizing of Toronto that's occurring, that every corner of every major street now has buildings with 2 or 3 floors of commercial and sports facilities and athletics and meeting rooms, and then the apartments for the single gentrified downtown consumer. This is a big change. The city is booming, and there are danger signals all around.
When saving a life means getting involved in a situation that could be deadly, few people are willing to take the risk, as Edwin Ortiz discovered on the night of September 7th, 1987.
We were going up to Columbia University, where they have a dance every first Friday of the month. We headed down to Broadway to the 50th Street station to take the subway up to Columbia University.
One floor below, a crowd of people were waiting for the uptown local, due any minute.
This woman came out of nowhere and started yelling, "There's someone in the track." I just reacted to the situation. I just ran straight down. I didn't think about the possibility of a subway coming into the station.
Edwin jumped onto the tracks along with another bystander and Melvin Shadd.
There was nothing he could do because he was knocked out. I mean, I couldn't just stand there and watch a train run over.
The train was due to arrive at the station in less than a minute. From the platform above, Edwin's friend Dennis Diaz tried to help.
Edwin and the 2 guys that were down there started to push him up. He was very heavy, this man.
I think everyone that was up there has such a fear of going into the subway tracks because you read about people being thrown in front of a train and, you know, you don't want to become a statistic.
When I looked up, you could see the lights coming, you know, on the rail, and we kept struggling. I looked up again, and there it was.
I really had no idea what was happening. You know, your best friend that you've, you know, gone through everything with jumps into a track and you don't know what's going on.
Transit cop Sean McGowan radioed his dispatcher, who sent a transit rescue unit to the station, including EMT Frank Berlanger.
Truck 1, when we receive a call of someone on the tracks, right away we think the worst scenario. Having a 4,000-ton train strike or hit you in any shape, way, or form is going to do major damage.
I was able to lay back down. You can sort of yell down into the tracks.
Hey, you guys okay? Yeah, man.
And at that point, I heard him. The first thing that came to my mind was, move this damn train out of the way. Get me out of here. I had soil and blood on my arm, and I was like, where is this coming from? I thought I had hurt myself somehow without realizing it. But then I looked at him, and he really cracked open his head just as the subway was coming into the station. We noticed that there was a crawl space underneath the platform. We just went whack right underneath the platform and crawled in.
Within 5 minutes, the rescue unit arrived.
When we got there, they were in a peculiar situation where there was a third rail, and that one is fired up with 600 volts electricity, or 600 volts that would kill you instantly.
We need help.
The undercarriage of a train is also electrified with the 600 volts.
Calm down. All right. Just try to breathe. All right.
All I kept thinking was, this city is so screwed up that they can't take the subway train and move it 25 feet down to let us out.
You guys all right?
Dennis yells down to me that they didn't want to move the subway train because they didn't know if any parts of our bodies or parts of our clothes were on the track, and if they moved it, it would grab onto one of us and drag us down.
This guy's in bad shape.
At one point, he regains his consciousness and starts to grab for the underside of the train. At which point, Jeff and I panicked because we're holding on to him. We'll get electrocuted and die.
All right. I saw where they were located. I screamed to my partner, get this power off immediately. They're near the contact shoe of the train.
When rescuers saw that the victim was in danger of being electrocuted before they could get the voltage turned off, they decided they couldn't wait.
If we get power off immediately, Kay, we got live people under the train.
Responding to these jobs, the people on the train, our primary equipment to bring down is a trauma box, which consists of all kinds of medical equipment, and the body bag. Upon seeing me, I think it relaxed them a little, but also built up their anxiety to get out of there quick.
I'm gonna place the bag over the shoe to protect you. All right?
With the body bag up against the power shoe, there was non-conductive material between me and the shoe. So I don't think I would have gotten electrified if I did touch it.
At that point, all I wanted was to get out of there, because I started thinking about what was down there. In New York, we have rats the size of chihuahuas.
Nice and easy, a little more. Reach up for the plaque. Try to stand up. He sustained a couple of lacerations, one to the head and arm. So we bandaged his wounds. We put a cervical collar on his neck because of the fall he had taken.
The 23-year-old victim was taken to the hospital for examination and released without serious injury.
The three of us wouldn't have been there, what would have happened? Because out of all the people there, only 3 people attempted to do something. Because if I was me down there on the tracks, I would want people to get involved and save me. So what goes around comes around, you know.
I just sat down and I just started to shake. I was like, what the hell did I do? And I was like, you're crazy. Why did you do this? But, you know, a lot of people think that New Yorkers are cold and heartless and wouldn't, you know, help their neighbors. And it's true to a certain extent. There are a lot of people like that in New York, but I think there are also a lot of people who would help somebody who needed help.
The guys who did jump onto the tracks to save this individual, I think they were heroes for doing it, brave for doing it, foolish in a way, but it was something that had to be done, and someone had to do it.
Victim Alex Krumba had suffered an epileptic seizure that caused him to fall onto the tracks. 3 years later, Alex and his father looked back on the night he nearly lost his life.
I didn't believe it happened to me, and the second shock was that somebody actually risked their own life to save me. Those 2 people that did that was just incredible.
And I was amazed because to find people that will look after you in this city is very hard. And I'm very thankful to them. And I wish that one day I could do something for them. And I guess my son was lucky that he had two angels next to him.
If New York is the city that never sleeps, it's largely because of its subway. No other city, not London with its tube, nor Paris with its metro, offers its residents underground transport 24 hours a day, year-round. Coney Island is the depot from which many of the trains pull out. This is the largest such facility in the world, where over 1,000 carriages are stored, scrubbed and serviced before they set out to cover the 230 miles that make up the system. Some have been turned into a rolling art form, at least in the eyes of the graffiti fiends. Many more have been replaced or reconditioned in a major offensive led by the city's transit authority to revitalize their stock. From the moment the first train started running in 1904, New Yorkers have shown an affinity for the clank and clatter of steel wheels on rail. And, despite its many shortcomings, every day over 3.5 million people still travel on the world's most celebrated subway. There are even a few who have traveled the entire length of the system, passing through the 463 stations that serve 4 of New York's 5 boroughs: Queens, Brooklyn, the Bronx, and Manhattan. 3 routes, the Interborough Rapid Transport, or IRT, Brooklyn Manhattan Transit, or BMT, and the IND for Independent, all converge on Manhattan Island, the nerve center of both city and subway. This is the New York known to millions who will never visit it. Below, less than 1 million people live in Manhattan, but every day over 5 million come to work or play there. The vast majority, 85% and rising, are transported by subway. David Gunn was appointed president of the New York City Transit Authority in 1984. His first task was to deal with the problems that had arisen in the mid-70s when the city almost went broke and crime, dirt and deterioration had driven thousands of riders off the subway and onto surface transport systems.
The city of New York cannot function without the subway. And the quality of the subway service has an impact in innumerable areas in this city. And there's no question in my mind that the city suffered as a result of the reputation of the New York City subway system. As the subway system gets back on its feet, begins to function well, and do its job in an increasingly effective manner, that redounds to the city's benefit. I mean, this is a city where the subway is part of the ethic and the ethos or the image of the city, the New York City subway system. It mirrors, in a sense, everything that's good and bad about the city. Everybody's down there. It's a very democratic experience because the city forces people to ride the subway. Almost everybody has to ride that subway system at one time or another. And so you see a complete cross-section of this city when you ride the subway system. They're all there. Everybody's down there. It's not only transportation, it's entertainment.
59th Street, the southern border of Central Park, and a frontier of sorts between Midtown and Uptown, between one way of life and another. Midtowners, who own some of the most expensive apartments in the world, meet Uptowners campaigning for basic rent controls. Little more in common than the daily dependence on the subway. The fare's the same for everyone. A $1 token takes you as far as you want to go. The social melting pot of New York never stops boiling. The earlier immigrant communities of European Jews, Italians, Irish, gave way to blacks, Hispanics, and Orientals. To the newcomers, usually poor and confused, the subway was as essential as ever. But even they tried to avoid using it. When a passenger used a gun against muggers, there was applause, but many New Yorkers saw their worst fears realized. Even without Bernard Goetz, the New York press has always ensured that subway travelers were fully aware of the risks they take.
Obviously, what you're dealing with is the perception of that people have of the subway system. I think the subway system is safe. I ride it myself all the time, and I've ridden it every hour of the night and day. And the system statistically is safe. We have problems, but we're moving 5 million people a day in this system, and obviously you're going to have some crime.
If David Gunn were to ride out into Brownsville, East New York, and Brooklyn, through the South Bronx, he'd probably need rubber underwear and a bulletproof vest. He'd have a far different view of the subway system that he feels is getting so much better. On 49th Grand Concourse. All right, so make sure you spread out on the cars once we get in.
Curtis Sliwa is self-appointed leader of the Guardian Angels, a group of young vigilantes who strode out of the badlands of the South Bronx and into the city's imagination. The idea came to Sliwa, he claims, while he was a regular passenger on Train 4, the Muggers Express. The authorities regard the Angels with suspicion, although the mayor of New York welcomed their efforts. They have no particular authority. Should they catch anyone committing a crime, they can, like any citizen, detain them until the police arrive. So far as the transit authority is concerned, they are fare-paying passengers like any others.
The further you get away from the core of the city, Manhattan, and you get into the outer boroughs, more isolated the stations, far less police, and even the physical atmosphere is more depressing and more palatable to a wide variety of criminals. Assume that you were the victim of crime. You had just been robbed of your money, or raped, or attacked. Would you have been roaming about many minutes looking for police? Or might you not have just gotten back on the train, gone home, said some prayers, and thanked God that you were still alive? That's what typically happens to many victims. They can't stand around waiting for police. So when you see Guardian Angels in the subway train or on the platform, you feel better because you say, out of all the people who may be here at this point, if I were to be targeted by some criminal, pickpocket, jostler, sexual deviant, I know that these young men in the red berets will risk their life to defend me, even though they may not even know me, may be of different color or a different background. We're just about as close as you can get to those kind of superheroes, those comic book cartoon heroes that exist in real life. And the best thing is they're real people.
The Guardian Angels have since expanded their operations above ground to the more threatening neighborhoods served by the subway. Times Square, crossroads of the city, has lost much of its luster since the 20s and 30s, and today drug dealers of all kinds, particularly those specializing in the debilitating crack, share the sidewalk with bewildered tourists and Broadway theatergoers, all of them trying to dodge the hell-bent cab. This is New York at its most manic, and not surprisingly, the subway stop below has the system's highest crime rate. With 250,000 people passing through its maze of corridors and tunnels every day, it's also the most heavily patrolled.
Child at 7-2 on Broadway.
The Transit Police of New York are the 5th largest force in the country, with a jurisdiction that requires specialist training for underground crime fighting.
In 1987, there was about 1,650 homicides in New York City, throughout the entire city. 7 of those homicides occurred on the subway system. The New York City subway system has several contributing factors that lends itself to the perception of crime and fear on the system. First of all, it's underground. There is a natural tendency to be fearful of going under the ground. And now people not only have to deal with that initial fear, but they find themselves in an environment that is less than hospitable. And if they see somebody acting disorderly, or they see somebody evading the fare, jumping over a turnstile, or not paying their fare to get on a train, now they not only find themselves in a hostile environment, but they think that they're there with criminals. The vast majority of the transit police officers on patrol in the system at any given time are uniform officers. They're out there. Their primary purpose is to deter crime, to lend aid to passengers who need it, to make apprehensions of people who are committing crimes or committing minor violations, quality of life type of violations that detract from the environment.
Can you wait on the steps? Can you get up the steps, please? Go sit over there. Can you get up the steps? Blocking the traffic here. It's a dangerous place to sit. Okay?
Every weekend, Grand Central Station is flooded with New Yorkers evacuating town. But deep below the grandeur of its concourse, there are daily dramas. This is Grand Central Tower, one of the subway's busiest control rooms, where high-tech means hands-on. While the system preserves an impressive safety record, traffic control depends on radio contact rather than computer automation, and margins of error are slight indeed.
I have your attention, please, uptown riders, uptown 4, 5, and 6 riders. Due to the fire department in the area of 14th Street, we have a delay in uptown service. Arriving on the uptown express track now is the number 6 train. This train is being rerouted to Woodlawn Road. Disregard the signs, this uptown number 6 being rerouted to Woodlawn and Jerome. We have extensive delays at this time. This number 6 train will be going to Woodlawn and Jerome.
A fire in the old wooden sleepers of the elevated tracks creates a familiar delay for the beleaguered controllers to deal with. At times, it seems this antiquated system is held together by rubber bands and string, a miracle that it works at all. It relies heavily on services like the city fire department. Less than half the $4 billion or so a year the subway needs to operate is raised from fares, and the shortfall must be made up by reluctant tax and road toll payers. There's never enough money to go round. The neglects of the 1970s forced safety to the top of the agenda for the transit authorities. To regain public confidence, their immediate priority has been upgrading maintenance facilities, rolling stock, and tracks. The big cleanup, they call it.
The New York City subway system had fallen on hard times. Basically, the entire physical plant was a wreck. Car fleet was a wreck. It was covered with graffiti. It was dirty. It didn't work well. Had tremendous deferred maintenance. The track was in real serious trouble. And all of the other infrastructure items, pumps, fans, and so forth, were in serious trouble. By rebuilding the system, we've been able to eliminate or drastically reduce the possibility of certain events. For example, a derailment or a fire, a serious fire. But on top of that, what we've done is, particularly with the car fleet, and we're really proud of that, we've gotten the car fleet so that 90% of the car fleet now looks pretty good. It's clean, it's free of graffiti, and of course it's running much better because we've rebuilt. Over half the fleet is either new or rebuilt, and the rest of it will be done in the near future. But the car fleet is almost totally restored from a visual perspective.
If the face of the subway is changing, Midtown Manhattan is forcing the pace, as always. Tiffany's, Trump Tower, Saks Fifth Avenue, Radio City Music Hall. Like the subway, every corner of New York seems as familiar as an old tune. Currently, the city is attracting 20 million visitors a year, most of whom seem to gather at lunchtime on Fifth Avenue. As gridlock spreads to the sidewalk, business executives take to the BMT to make their next appointment. For New Yorkers like author and columnist Jimmy Breslin, the subway is not only a means of avoiding the crowd.
New York is the only place I could live because I happen to be one of the 4 or 5 members of the free world who cannot drive a car. I must live atop a subway or I simply don't move. So I would sit in the back of cars smoking a cigar and giving directions to 1,000 different drivers, wives and relatives, and it drove them crazy. And I love that aspect of it, and then whenever I would get into a traffic jam with them, I'd just get out of the car and say goodbye, and I'd walk downstairs and get on the subway. It comes from Brooklyn all the way through to Manhattan. It takes someone from the crummiest slum in Brooklyn, a mother with kids with no chance to go anywhere, gets on a subway and takes them to the Museum of Natural History on 81st Street and Central Park West, or across the 5th Avenue to the Museum of Art. Now that sounds like someone talking, yes, the glories of New York. It actually does happen. We have a poor population. It's to our shame forever. At the same time, we probably have the most cultured and smartest poor on the face of the earth because of the subway.
Nothing stays the same in New York. Upper Manhattan is pushing northwards, and Harlem, for years a black ghetto, is now under siege from property investors and gentrifiers. Reluctant tenants are being pushed further out, to the Bronx and beyond, as their brownstones and tenement blocks await a facelift. Residents like Mamie Stone have observed that lower prices are not the only reason the area is attracting so much attention.
This is the only part of town that I can think of, off the top of my head, that has all the subway systems that stop it. Now, what the train actually does is that it makes it possible for us to connect with the other parts of the city. New York itself, it makes it possible for us to connect with the Bronx. So we use it for work. We use it for play. We use it for interacting with people. Harlem right now is the most sought after real estate property in the world, I say. Right now, the homes that we struggle to hold on to, the places that some of the buildings that we can't afford to buy, to keep, to maintain, to renovate, that are closed, are now being bought up by other people. So that Harlem, that has now become a black Mecca, paradise, or even a place of not really beauty to other people, is now being sought by other people as their future home.
It's perhaps not surprising that the subway is partly responsible for pushing up property prices here. 125th Street is Harlem's main street, where 3 lines cross, served by no less than 10 different trains, among them the A train.
I remember myself as a child on the train, and it only cost a nickel to ride the subway. And we would get at the front end of the A train, and we would watch as the train swerved and curved and would speed down the rail. And that was part of our excitement. That was our entertainment.
Yes. For the A train, take a little ride around the city. Brooklyn, clear up to Harlem. You see, New York is mighty pretty. Take your baby subway riding. That's where a romance gotta be hiding. Forget your plane or airplane. You'll find New York is mighty pretty. Get aboard the A train.
New York's may not be the world's oldest subway, that's London, nor the busiest, that's Tokyo. But the A train is undoubtedly one of the world's greatest subway rides.
New York is mighty pretty.
207th Street and Washington Heights, way up on the northern tip of Manhattan, is where the A train starts. Down through Harlem, it trundles on the L tracks before plunging below ground onto the Upper West Side, fringing Central Park, traveling south to take in some of New York's finest sights.
Slower trains, which stop at all stations, are known as locals. As an express, the A train stops only at certain stations. Its official name is the 8th Avenue Express. Duke Ellington would have found that harder to put to music. Midtown, its first stop is 59th Street, then on to 42nd Street and Times Square. Expert subway riders know how to switch among the various routes to travel in the shortest possible time. Penn Station is where many will make their connection. Here, passengers can transfer to bus or mainline railway for ongoing journeys, or emerge into Madison Square Garden. Others will wait impatiently for their homeward-bound locals. Much of what is most shocking and exasperating about New York is encapsulated in Penn Station. Night and day, it resembles a kind of Times Square undercover, a refuge, in addition, for the homeless who haunt the public spaces of this great and wealthy metropolis. The city that can move 5 million passengers in its subways and buses every 24 hours seems unable to house its few thousand social inadequates. For the A train, next stop is 14th Street, and then West 4th and Washington Square, marking the invisible line between Midtown and downtown, and Greenwich Village. This is prime real estate. The small streets taken over by affluent singles and young couples just beginning their climb up the ladder of prosperity. The once dominant Italian atmosphere has been diluted and mixed with other European influences. Old hangouts of writers and painters have to fight to keep their identity or resist being transformed into the next inn, restaurant, or gallery, depending on the week or the weather. New Yorkers are nothing if not fickle. Every weekday, the majority of A-train commuters head further south to Chambers Street and the World Trade Center. Peak hour is 8:30, when trains disgorge thousands of office-bound workers into the country's major financial institutions. Wall Street is still its heart, and few American banks or brokers could afford not to have their headquarters nearby. This end of Manhattan Island was the site of the earliest European settlement in the 17th century by Dutch colonists. The landmarks that dominate the city today are the soaring twin towers of the World Trade Center, at 110 stories each, still New York's tallest. The so-called B&T crowd, who use New York's bridges and tunnels to commute, have to face the most horrendous journey into work. Only the subway saves the city from being jammed solid at this time, and the dreaded gridlock. While some subway routes share the Manhattan Bridge with the motor traffic above it, the A train speeds its way under the East River, through to Brooklyn and beyond, via the Fulton-Cranberry Tunnel. Once it leaves Manhattan, it'll still be less than halfway through its daily journey, traveling 35 miles through 36 stations, the world's longest subway ride. For visitors, it's perhaps the cheapest tour in town. For commuters, there's a terrific view of Manhattan twice a day. The Alice train, as the controllers call it, takes an hour and a half from end to end, winding its way through the depths of Brooklyn, pausing at JFK Airport, before finally reaching its destination, Rockaway Beach, on the shores of the Atlantic.
The A train is a great train, the longest train ride for $1 in the world. It starts in a dense city neighborhood and it ends at the shores of the Atlantic Ocean. I mean, where are you going to get a ride like that? People say the rattle, the rumble of the subway, and it sways and it's hot and noxious. To me, a subway line runs on silk. It's smooth and it's wonderful. We're nothing without it. You'll find New York is mighty, mighty pretty. There is no city without the subway, as there is no Breslin in New York without the subway, there would be no city of New York without the subway.
Forget your car or airplane, you'll find it takes 68 train. Yeah. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming out.
Offers many reminders of Britain's past glory, and in the new skyline of this endlessly rebuilt, refurbished, reshaped old capital, many a token of promise. One of the great achievements of Queen Victoria's reign was the world's first underground railway. It was begun in 1863 and was to be copied all over the world. The significance of this mighty leap forward in transit technology can be deduced, even without a visit to the legendary home of Britain's first great fictional detective. Elementary, really. Baker Street was one of the 5 stations on the Pioneer Metropolitan line. The Industrial Revolution had seen London's population increase enormously. The new underground was a radical solution to London's growing transportation problems. Baker Street has been restored to something like the way it looked when it first delivered London's commuters to the square mile of the City of London, then as now the financial district.
To understand how and why London's transport systems were set up, you need to understand that the city is the focus, that people needed to get in and out of there to work. That's where the markets were, literally the cattle markets as well as the financial markets. There were traffic problems, and we're talking now about the 1850s. Tremendous traffic problems in what was central London. The solution put forward was to go underground. That was going to be a good time to be digging holes in the ground and at the same time cleared a lot of slums. Now the Victorians thought this was a good thing because clearing slums is a good thing. You may see a photograph in the museum of the Prime Minister at the time, William Gladstone, sitting, looking rather uncomfortable in an open truck, about to be taken underground, hauled by a steam locomotive. So it was something that was really a tremendous event.
Coal-burning trains underground? Some way had to be found to prevent the passengers from choking to death in the fumes.
It was running in large double tunnels, so that you were operating in a fairly big space, not like the deep-level tubes, but fairly large tunnels with lots of ventilation holes. Certainly standing in the station, the train would be able to vent directly into the atmosphere. So that's how they tried to do it. What had to be revolutionary was the design of the locomotives, which again you can see in the museum, so that when they were running in covered sections, they could condense the steam.
Steam trains only operated beneath the surface for quite short distances, so their future in the underground was limited. In 1890, long before electricity was in general use, the new electric traction engine made possible the first true underground running in deep tunnels of circular metal tubes. With astonishing speed, the shape of today's underground map began to form. By 1910, the tube, as it became known, was a familiar part of everyday life. During World War I, from 1914 to 18, it played a regular part in the capital's nightlife as well. Shelter from German Zeppelins. Again in World War II, 60,000 Londoners a night were grateful for the miles of deep tunnels beneath the streets. Without them, many would not have survived Hitler's Blitz, or the rain of buzz bombs that followed. In the early days of peace, what could be rebuilt was rebuilt. The city's famous landmarks, the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, as the Bank of England is known, and nearby, the Lord Mayor of London's power base, Mansion House, soon looked as they always had. But with London's importance as a financial centre reasserted, very different buildings began to soar where some of the old had stood. Between the 1930s and the 1980s, the nature of London's working population changed completely. A different breed of moneymaker had evolved, with wider horizons. Living and working in places quite different from their predecessors, the new city slickers changed age-old patterns of London life. Communications came to mean more than just the means of getting to work. As money and commodity markets became global, London made the best of its position midway between New York and Tokyo, in time as well as distance. London town began to spread. This sugar warehouse, built by Napoleonic war prisoners, could not be destroyed. As a protected historical building, it's been converted into a shopping mall. But on the banks of the Thames in the East End, vast reaches of derelict docklands have become the biggest building site in Europe. Great national newspapers and other businesses moved to docklands. In the 19th century, this viaduct carried an historic primitive railway, one of the first in the world. Hitched to a cable, carriages were towed to and fro by a stationary steam engine at one end. However, that vintage apparatus was probably better suited to its purpose than the public transit system that was at first thought adequate for the new docklands. By 1992, this frisky little conveyance, the Docklands Light Railway, will have to cope with 100,000 passengers a day. That's 10 times more than its planners had foreseen. Even if its capacity can be effectively increased, the stations at which the light railway connects to the ancient underground system are already jammed to their limits. Shifts in the balance of London living took transport planners by surprise. The underground has long since reached beyond London's ones. The inner postal districts, N1, E1, W1 for West 1, and so on. Baker Street has become an interchange for 5 tube lines. In 10 years, traffic on the underground increased by 70%, 2,750,000 passengers a day, over 700 million a year. The system is now spread over 275 stations and 254 miles, enabling the expanding white-collar class to set up house in a range of inner suburbs like this. 10 stops northwest of Baker Street, people who chose to live here have enjoyed tube travel for over a century. Until relatively recently, this was unquestionably the finest, as well as the largest urban transport system in the world. It's still adequate at any time other than rush hour. 60% of the track is above ground. The trains that spend most time in the open air are squared off and tall. True tube trains have low-built, curved roofs. New prototype cars being tested in the 80s include new methods of body construction, smoother braking and acceleration, new passenger information systems, heating and ventilation, air suspension, and computerized multiplex control. Because the area south of the Thames was already well served by Britain's mainline trains, only 30 of the tube's 275 stations are south of the river. Most commuters from there, 225,000 a day, take British rail trains into London's Waterloo station. The human wave flows in and out of Waterloo twice every day, regular as the tides. Some 70,000 passengers still have to find their way across the river to central London, taking a tube to the final destination, which might be miles further on. The escalator was an American invention which replaced all except 26 of the original tube elevators, or lifts, in the 20s and 30s. Both these aging people movers are being renewed in anticipation of a 10% increase in the number of travelers by 1995. A born-again tube system must transport its passengers safely and efficiently. Loudspeakers warn of little hazards.
Mind the gap. Mind the gap. Stand clear of the doors, please.
Updating the infrastructure of this venerable city and its grand old tube is a way of life for Londoners.
I'm a Londoner before I'm anything else, before I'm English or British or anything. I mean, grew up here, lived here. So I'm a Londoner, but I'm that kind of, I'm an underground Londoner, if you like. London to me was the tube line. I'd get into central London, and central London meant everything, really. That meant the world. And it also meant that I had the British Museum half an hour away, or I had a football team at the other end of a very complicated system an hour away that every Saturday I would trudge across the sea to West London. It meant that I had a city to call my own, and I was part of it, really. It gave me a community. I never ride on buses. Buses are funny. Londoners walk, get cabs, or they travel on the tube. Because that's the way that I grew up knowing London, is the tube lines. When you've got to manage 16 stops to get to Tottenham Court Road, you can think up loads of games to play on the Underground. One of them is spot the destination. And that means you look at the person and you decide from what they're wearing and how they're behaving and what paper they're reading, where they're going to get off. And I would be 85% accurate by the time I was 14, because I've had like 7 or 8 years of doing this every day now almost. And you can spot whether a person is a Golders Greener or whether they're a Hampsteadite. London kind of exists up alleyways, and in the back rooms, the snugs of pubs, where they maintain those Londons. And it exists on the fringes of the street markets, or it exists at 8 o'clock of a Sunday morning, but not at 9 o'clock, because you were there at the wrong time. And I think London is like that. It's a city that hides its pleasures to the outsiders, but revels in them quietly among its own.
Riding the boundary of Soho and Chinatown, which mated. Some Londoners worry about the survival of London's traditions.
Sadly, I think London has been, in the last 20 years, and is being very, very negligent with its hidden heritages. Of course, we list the great buildings, and, you know, you can't knock down Buckingham Palace to put a multi-storey car park. But you can turn, sadly, something like Covent Garden, which used to be a living, thriving London street market. You know, my mum would go there and get flowers if she really wanted a good spread. If someone had died or someone was getting married, you'd go to Covent Garden. And what did we do with it? We turned it into a place that sells souvenirs in a mock Italian esplanade. I mean, it's a very strange and wanton way to deal with our history, I think. I think it's partly that London suffers from its own success. You know, London is such a big, sprawling city that too few people live in its heart. Not many people live in those ones anymore. They all live out. And because our communications are developed to a level where they can, they've had to divorce themselves from where they work So London, where people used to live and work cheek by jowl, they don't much anymore.
Eros, the god of love, marks the centre of London, particularly tourist London. Visitors come from all over the world to be reminded of the things they left behind. Piccadilly Circus Station is one of the busiest in London's West End. If they want to sing the praises of one of the great engineering feats of all time, they need nothing more than a ticket to the wonderland beneath. When it was first opened in 1928, the subterranean complex underlying Piccadilly Circus Tube Station was one of the marvels of the age. It still is. Londoners are avid newspaper readers. Donald Trelford, editor of the world's oldest Sunday paper, The Observer, has relocated from Fleet Street.
I still retain something of the provincial's sense of wonder about the big city. I mean, even today, for example, my drive to work takes me through Trafalgar Square and along Whitehall, past the Houses of Parliament, and occasionally I divert to go down the Malls that I pass Buckingham Palace, and I still retain something of that great feeling for the city, which has always seemed to me to be a city designed for a huge empire, rather than for running this little island. One of the things I miss since we've moved from Fleet Street and everybody's moved is that I used to enjoy going to the Garrick Club at lunchtime, where in the bar of the Garrick Club, any weekday between 12:30 and 1, and if anything had happened in British society, in politics, publishing, the press, the law, any gossip, you'd hear it in the Garrick Club. And if you didn't hear it, some member of the government would come tumbling in from a cabinet meeting and tell you. And afterwards, it used to give me great pleasure to walk back to my office those days, and I'd walk through Covent Garden, where I'd meet people from the theatre world, because my newspaper's involved with the Olivier Theatre Awards, and I'm on the committee, and you'd catch up on the gossip in the theatre world. I think the best thing is that the culture of the theatre world is still, preeminent, and that's, something we take too much for granted. I think that the worst thing about London is the sort of traffic pollution, which is getting worse and worse, and we just don't seem to have any ideas for tackling it.
By the end of the 1980s, surface congestion in London had become so bad that major businesses were budgeting millions for the losses it caused them. The tube seemed to many Londoners the only hope of getting people out of their cars and off the streets. But as the ancient tube struggled to ease the congestion above, its aged joints were creaking from lack of financial lubrication. It's the only form of transport invented in the 19th century that is capable of being improved in the 20th. But successive governments avoided underwriting any real modernization of equipment and rolling stock. Yet, when Donald Trelford has to be on time for an appointment, he abandons his company car and takes the tube. But he still finds walking more enjoyable.
Then you'd walk down past the Inns of Court and the Temple, and you'd meet lawyers who are either defending you or about to prosecute you, or see some judge, who's about to pass sentence on you.
I know, but I'm losing that one. Really? He can put together from the judgment of the judge, or summing up.
And you'd continue to walk down Fleet Street and you'd meet chums from other newspapers or people who used to work within the provinces, and on back to the office, or if not the office, to one of those seedy little snooker clubs in the environs of Fleet Street.
Show me a good pool player, the old saying went, and I'll show you a man who has a misspent youth. Or an editor whose paper comes out only once a week. The River Thames has been called 2,000 years of liquid history. Since before the Romans, London has grown around the river. It was once the most used means of transportation for people and cargo. The 80s have seen an increase in recreation and commercial passenger traffic. Descendants of the early watermen still ply their trade.
We used to be the original taxi drivers, used to take people up and down the river because obviously there was no roads and mud lanes. The river used to be absolutely jam-packed with ships and craft, and we're trying to restore a bit of commercial work on it, especially with the development of Docklands. The barge race I'm rather proud of.
This barge race, begun in 1973, is a brave annual attempt to keep up the traditions of the River Thames. It is rowed between the palaces of Greenwich, downstream, and Westminster, 7 miles. In the heyday of the river, however, one man would take a barge up and down on the tides, ferrying 50 tons of cargo at a time.
It's a beautiful river, it's a lovely river, but it's a very, very dangerous river. It's a good friend and a bad enemy. But not even old Father Thames can solve the problem of moving London's people about. Attractive as the idea of waterborne passenger transport is, it has been tried more often than it has succeeded. The only means of handling the volume necessary lies underground. It took a disaster, an accidental fire at King's Cross Underground Station in 1988, which killed 31 people, to make both public and authorities aware of just how decrepit the tube system had become. The entire structure, trains, lines, stations, apparatus, was showing its age. Everyone could see there was overcrowding, broken and combustible escalators, dirty carriages, and too few trains, and gaps in the service. The King's Cross fire made tube renovation a political priority. The most visible sign of good intent was the appearance of these stylish, elegant, and costly new cars.
It's always a problem with any technology if you're first. You've also got a problem that you have stations which are 80 years old, for example, in terms of the deep-level tubes. Now, the investment asked for by the transport professionals was not forthcoming, and that's in effect what's happened to the underground, that it's been allowed to deteriorate over a very long period. But a tremendous investment is going on right now, and I'm sure you will have seen tremendous changes, updating of the stations to try and make them the pleasant sort of environment everyone would like them to be. But it's a bit like taking over a house, you know, that nobody's cared for 20 years and you're trying to do it all yourself. It takes time.
The way ahead for the underground, with £500 million to spend, is in the hands of Wilfred Newton. He pioneered the impressive new Hong Kong Underground and ran it at a profit. He approves of the sign in the new cars that shows passengers the name of the next station. He also understands safety, as he explained in Hong Kong.
We have to run this as a business. We have to borrow the money on international capital markets. When you're running anything such as a mass transit railway, you have to be literally obsessed with safety.
London, he has to reconcile somewhat conflicting demands to make the tube safe, less crowded and profitable, but not price passengers off it into the traffic pollution on the roads.
I still believe that my grandchildren are going to have a London that they'll feel proud of. And they're still going to have a London that they'll recognise from Dickens, and a London that they'll recognise from Pepys, and a London that I hope they'll recognise from Robert Elms. Because I think there is a continuum of those Londons, and you can't kill it, because it's in the soul of its people. So it's the myths dating back to great fires and plagues, and then it's the myths of, you know, Wat Tyler leading rebellions against people, and it's, you know, the myths right up to the old Jack the Rippers in the East End. And it's the myths of the swinging 60s, and it's now the myths of punk rockers in the 70s, and it's the myths of style in the 80s. And each time it creates new myths, and those myths get written down, or occasionally they get filmed, but most they just get remembered.
Perhaps a newly restored London Underground will take its place among these myths. Germany to reunite. This is the last rare documentary film to be shot in both the divided East and West Berlins with their common subway link. This is history, the way it was for 28 years, before the wall came down with its resultant problems. Berlin was the capital of Germany for 66 years, from 1871 to 1945. In the 1930s, it was the third largest city in the world after London and New York. But the symbols of those days of grandeur have long been replaced in modern minds by the 75-mile-long wall that divided the city into East and West. The East's chopper, warning us off. Hundreds of East Germans were killed or captured trying to get past the wall into West Berlin. Checkpoint Charlie. Many dramatic incidents took place at the crossing point that has become a byword in every language. Without it, hundreds of spy thrillers might never have been written. Checkpoint Charlie was the only gateway between East and West Berlin for foreigners on foot and for cars. But it was Berlin's subway that breached the wall for East and West Berliners. One U-Bahn, for underground railway, goes from the west through the east and back again. Or take the S-Bahn, for Schnellbahn, or fast railway, elevated for the best scenic tour of East Berlin. An East German driver would take over for the East sector. This switch would be reversed on the return journey. East Berlin's skyline was dominated by its television tower, 147 feet higher than the Eiffel Tower. The journey from the hub of West Berlin to the transfer station Friedrichstraße in East Berlin took only 30 minutes. Friedrichstraße. This must have been the only subway station in the world where you'd need documentation to buy a ticket. In spite of the relative ease with which they could visit the East, West Berliners were happy to return at night to their more comfortable, free and easy city. Not far from West Berlin's new opera house was the voice of political experience, how West Berliners lived in a divided and occupied city.
The former victorious powers, the Soviet Union, United States, Great Britain, and France, decided to divide Germany after the end of World War II, and they decided to divide again Berlin as the former capital of the German Reich. And so we came about 4 sectors, 4 Allied sectors in Berlin, Russian, American, British, French one. During the development of the Cold War, this 4-power consensus broke up, and it came to the point where we had one administration in the Russian sector, which is now East Berlin, and one administration in West Berlin. We call them the protective powers, which means they are not there for occupational reasons, but for the freedom of Berlin. The normal Berliner has his contacts with the American authorities or the Allied authorities too, by seeing American, French, and British soldiers in the city. Berlin is the only area in the world where, as we say, people are happy to be occupied.
The wall separated families as well, which made the right to cross it so important to Berliners.
West Berliners have a special understanding of their duty towards East Berlin and the GDR. We have more than 2 million visits of West Berliners per year.
After the final document check at Friedrichstrasse, visitors to the east could go wherever they wished. It cost them 5 marks for a day visa and 25 marks changed into East German currency at par, rather than the realistic 4-to-1. They found a city less prosperous than their own, although East Berlin had the fastest growing economy in the Eastern Bloc. Those who switched to the East Berlin U or S-Bahn to go deeper into the territory might have missed the brightly colored trains of the West Berlin subway. These are the only trains in the world to leave the stations with their doors still open. With a population of 1.3 million to cater to, the East system carries some 80 million passengers a year on its 2 lines. There are 12 miles of track and 22 stations. More than half the track is actually above ground, so that the flat rate fare buys a scenic tour as well as a ride. East Berlin's position as a showcase, as the capital of the German Democratic Republic, was highlighted by the impressive buildings watched over by the St. Marian Church. Everybody wanted to visit Alexanderplatz, or Alex, whether by U-Bahn or by S-Bahn. Outside the station, one could compare the nearby great squares of Alexanderplatz, the heart of pre-war Berlin, and Marx Engelsplatz. Visitors saw a display of glossy new hotels and department stores to prove East Berlin's prosperity as the Eastern Bloc's greatest metropolis after Moscow. East Berliners relaxed at the Republic Palace. Or they enjoyed the terrace of the Opera Cafe on Unter den Linden. Whatever East Berlin became, it owes to Mother Russia, the theme of this memorial to the entry of the victorious Red Army in 1944. It was largely accidental that when the city was divided, most of the grand public buildings and many of the oldest ones fell in the east. But so did the bulk of the 19th century tenements, which still bear the marks of the Russian arrival. West Berlin, too, flaunted its scars. Seen through this broken link sculpture is the war-damaged memorial church on the Kurfürstendamm, already a landmark when the broad avenue was being dug up at the turn of the century for the new underground wonder. The U-Bahn was built in open envy of the earlier built Paris Metro, which both its trains and stations resembled. From the beginning, it ran over as well as under the streets. By 1938, there were 5 lines covering nearly 50 miles. But this was still not impressive enough for some people. In the Nazi era, the more visible S-Bahn was the favored method of rapid transit. By 1943, it was carrying the astounding total of 737 million passengers a year. The memory of the 1945 victory over Nazism is preserved in the mangled church steeple and its U-Bahn sign. Some former American soldiers admire the Berliners' spirit that enabled them to rebuild their city.
I retired here in Berlin about 3 years ago. I stayed here, first of all, because I was here, and I liked it. I liked Berlin, and I liked the people, and I think, secondly, I stayed here because I found a good job doing the German-American Volksfest here. The basic reason a German-American Volksfest exists in Berlin is because the American command here feels an obligation to the Germans to make sure we get together on a very informal and atmosphere and have really a party together in the American section here of Berlin. That's probably the basic reason. I think they're very resilient people. They're very humorous person. You know, each Berliner has his own sort of sense of humor that is different than anything I've seen. It may equate to some of the humor you might see in London and New York. It's that kind of a city. The wall created a division between what was an autonomous population in 1961. This is the place where East and West divides. And the fact that we're 110 miles inside East Germany doesn't really change that. You have the Western influence coming into West Berlin and the Eastern influence coming into East Berlin. And some of the changes, though subtle, if that were to last over time, I think would be remarkable. Every wall comes down, whether it's Hadrian's Wall or whoever's wall, the Great Wall of China. Unless you maintain it constantly, it will come down. No, the wall has to come down eventually. People can't live in, I think, an atmosphere like that. And if it doesn't fall down of its own accord, then I think governments will take it down.
Robert Ahrens was right. The wall came down. But the traditional German goose step marched by East German soldiers was a crowd puller. This ceremony honors the dead of the Second World War. On the other side of the wall, the Western Allies defended their position. A British tank on patrol. They carried live ammunition. So did the East Germans. Accomplished. Some of the green spaces around the perimeter are not exactly nature's work. This hill, one of several, was built out of the rubble of the war-ruined city, scraped together and carried here by the only earth-moving equipment available amid the devastation, an army as formidable in its way as the once proud German army, the working women of Berlin. West Berlin often seemed to be a city of women, and women of a certain age at that. The men lost in the war had not yet been replaced. Young Berliners went to West Germany, where the future was more secure. But there were still nearly 2 million West Berliners, and the population was increasing. West Berlin liked to think of itself as a round-the-clock, anything-you-want kind of town. Department stores like this overflowed with luxuries. Citizens of West Berlin were usually ready to enjoy the moment. West Berlin's U-Bahn was rebuilt and expanded after the war. It now covers 66 miles, the longest in either Germany. Wittenbergplatz station is a restored Art Deco treasure with all the services a passenger could want. Most, however, just want a safe and speedy trip to their destination. And for 2 Deutschmarks, $1 US, they get it. Paris was one source of inspiration, but the signs have the style of London. Smart escalators only start to move when they're stepped on. And the brightly colored cars, more than 1,200 of them in service, are spotless. There are now 8 lines serving 119 stations. By the mid-1990s, a few routes will have been expanded. Of West Berlin's 185 square miles, less than half was urbanized. Leafy suburbs, where stations harbored sculpture gardens, parks, lakes, forest and farmland made up the rest of the U-Bahn's territory. The trains ducked and dived through unexpected hazards. A system that lived with the wall was not likely to be diverted by a mere house. More macabre was the underground route into the east, where ghost stations were closed and tunnels narrowed so that none could escape by clinging to the side of a train. Nollendorfplatz station is part museum, where old U-Bahn cars get a new lease of life, part flea market, where souvenirs of the old routes and other relics are on sale, and part cafe, since it was against all West Berliners' principles to walk more than a few steps without being able to find some coffee or a beer. Entertainment was non-stop too, and a theatrical writer-director explained how West Berliners felt about the wall.
When people come from abroad or Western Germany, they always ask me, how do you feel in this enclosed city with a wall around? And that's not the feeling the Berliners really got, because you don't see the wall. The wall looks very pretty from here. Many people, 50%, are born already with the wall, and we have no problems to go to the west and to go everywhere. Berlin is much bigger than people imagine. It's very green, it's got huge forests and everything. You don't feel enclosed and you don't see the wall, and that's a feeling for visitors, but merely not the feeling of the Berliners.
Volker Ludwig wrote a popular musical about Line 1 on the U-Bahn. It played in New York and London.
I didn't write a play about the U-Bahn. I situated it into the U-Bahn, into the underground, because I wanted to tell a lot of little stories. And so the underground is the ideal vehicle. People can go and leave, and that's just normal.
Everyone in awe, on every train that ran, and the fiddler with no valid ticket in his hand, followed immediately as the land.
Line 1 is the special underground from the center to the most colorful place of the city, to go to Kreuzberg, where the most foreigners, most students, artists, the most poor people are living, and so it's a very colorful mixture of people, and that's what I'm interested, especially in very old people and very young people. My age is not that interesting.
Ludwig's characters have their adventures on the West Berlin U-Bahn.
Some Berliners still remember when the transit system was undivided, just getting back into its stride when the wall went up. Then, by comparison with the densely developed West, the East was but a pale shadow on the West Berlin subway map. But looked at from the East point of view, the busy West tracks did not seem to exist at all. Hard by the west side of the wall, the Reichstag, the old parliament, was described as a building in waiting, waiting for reunification of the two Germanys. Now the waiting seems not in vain. But if Berliners were divided by the wall and the transit systems, they were united by their taste for culture. The Komische Opera in the East offset the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra in the West. In a nation that had 43 opera companies, singers were household names. Johann Kowalski, the much-traveled, world-famous countertenor, made East Berlin his home.
Ich habe festgestellt, dass
It has made me realize that there's a certain similarity in the outlook of people coming from London, Paris, Vienna, and those coming from Berlin. Even as a child, I had the firm intention of going to Berlin. Berlin is the capital. It represents life. Berlin became my childhood dream. I never thought I would sing in the very house where I attended performances as a 10-year-old. All the top performances in Berlin during the 1920s and 1930s took place in this very house. It's a wonderful feeling to stand on the same stage where Richard Tauber sang 50 years ago. Another of East Berlin's incomparable assets was the Pergamon Museum, a breathtaking assembly of treasures from the ancient world. The Pergamon, the Old Museum, the Teacup Church, Nikolai Church, Unter den Linden, which ended at the east side of the wall. It was once as celebrated an international thoroughfare as Fifth Avenue or the Champs-Élysées. The State Opera House is a fine example of war-damaged restoration. The Royal Library dates from 1730. Lenin studied there in 1893. In May 1933, it suffered the disgrace of the infamous burning of the books by the Nazis before its front doors. Berlin Cathedral, the Dome. The cultural policy of the GDR involved encouraging both Berlin's cultural heritage and new artworks by young artists. These cultural riches spilled over even into the U-Bahn, where the younger passengers were urged towards their own entertainment, pantomime. For them, trips on the U-Bahn to the museum or specially organized concerts were exciting adventures. Much of the East U-Bahn was decorated with emotive murals inspired by the city's post-war despair. On both sides of the wall, there was never a reference to East Berlin or West Berlin in the subway. Just Berlin.
But for Berliners from either side of the wall, there is a question. Now that the two halves of Berlin are being reunited, will Alex be the true center again?